Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking on a really fascinating, maybe sometimes overlooked topic: the legal frameworks, the sort of invisible rules that govern ancient cities like Athens and Rome.
That's right. A listener asked us to dig into how they protected their societies, their infrastructure. And, you might think immediately of the engineering, the aqueducts, the buildings themselves.
Yeah, the physical stuff.
Exactly. But what the sources really open up is, well, it's a deep dive into the laws they created. Not just for managing drains or roads, but for controlling political figures, enforcing really stark social divisions, and even defining basic concepts like trust.
Okay, so we're sort of charting a course through legal history here. We'll start in Athens, looking at their unique ways of policing politics, and then move over to Rome with its focus on codes and status.
And our mission really is to pull out those surprising bits of information, the specific rules, the court cases, the assumptions that reveal how power, money, and justice actually work day to day.
From the assembly in Athens to the courts in Rome. Let's get into it.
All right, let's begin in Athens. You have this explosion of democracy, but then comes the big question. How do you stop successful leaders, the popular ones, from becoming, well, tyrants?
It's the classic democratic dilemma, isn't it?
Mm.
And the Athenian response after Cleisthenes was quite radical. They looked at their government structure and deliberately tweaked it to police their own leaders.
How so? What was the key change regarding the top officials, the archons?
Traditionally, archons were elected, chosen specifically for their skills, their reputation, their ability. They were the establishment figures.
The best and brightest, presumably.
Presumably.
Hmm.
But the Athenians realized that concentrating power in elected officials, especially popular ones, could be dangerous for the democracy itself. So they introduced something quite different:
Which was?
selection by lot, sortition. This was already used elsewhere in their system, but applying it to the archons was a huge step.
How did that work exactly? They just drew names out of a hat. Pretty much, yeah. Well, first, 500 potential candidates were elected by the local districts, the deans. Then, from that group of 500, the 9 archons were chosen randomly by lot.
So merit, or popular choice for that specific job, just went out the window.
Completely. And our sources are pretty clear about the intended consequences.
Which were?
2 main things, really. First, they aimed for what you might call average honesty. The idea was to minimize the chance of a really brilliant but corrupt individual getting that top spot.
Okay, safety first.
But maybe even more significantly, the system was designed to deliberately exclude more than average ability. They consciously chose to sideline exceptional talent in that chief role.
That seems so counterintuitive to us today. We're always looking for the most capable person.
Right, but they were arguably more worried about the potential downsides of ambition. By making the archonship a lottery, its political importance basically vanished. No serious statesman could build a career hoping to land that job. The odds were just too long, like 500 to 1.
Okay, but if the archons aren't really leading anymore, especially in war, because the military archon, the pole march, is also chosen by lot now, you can't have a random citizen leading the army, can you?
Absolutely not. That would be disastrous. So the military command power had to shift.
Where did it go?
It transferred almost immediately to a different body. The 10 strategian, the generals, these guys were still elected, specifically for their military competence and experience.
Ah, so they kept meritocracy for the military, where it was obviously essential.
Yes, but even there, the Athenians initially tried a very democratic, perhaps overly cautious approach to prevent any one general getting too powerful.
What was that?
Our sources describe it as an early, almost childish experiment. They set up a system where each of the 10 generals held supreme command for just a single day on a rotating basis.
One day. Seriously, how could you possibly run a campaign like that?
Exactly. Imagine coordinating strategy when the commander changes every morning. It was, as the sources say, naturally doomed to failure in wartime. It just shows how deeply ingrained that fear of concentrated power was.
Okay, so they adjusted the magistracies, but they still needed a mechanism, a sort of emergency brake, to deal with citizens who became too successful, too influential, maybe dangerously popular.
And that brings us to ostracism, probably one of the most famous and frankly ingenious political tools the Athenians invented.
It sounds harsh, basically kicking someone out of the city.
It was harsh, 10 years of exile. But crucially, it wasn't a punishment for a crime they'd committed. It was purely political. Think of it like a pressure release valve for factional conflict.
How did it work? What made it a sort of security measure?
Well, first, the scale of participation required was huge. To even hold an ostracism, you needed a minimum quorum. 6,000 citizens had to vote. That's a massive number, maybe a quarter of the entire citizen body.
It wasn't a snap decision by a small group.
Not at all. And the voting itself was secret, using pottery shards, ostraca. This meant the result was likely to reflect genuine and independent sentiment, not just mob pressure or political maneuvering.
But you mentioned a mutual risk element. How did that police the politicians?
This was the really clever part. When an ostracism was initiated, everyone was potentially on the chopping block. There was no specific defendant. Citizens just wrote down the name of the person they most wanted exiled.
So if my faction wants to get rid of your guy?
Exactly. If Themistocles supporters wanted to ostracize Aristides, they had to consider the risk that their own leader, Themistocles, might end up being the one getting the most votes. It forced a degree of caution.
Because starting the process could backfire spectacularly.
Precisely. It made powerful factions think twice before trying to eliminate rivals, preventing that internecine hostility from coming to a head. It was preventative political medicine, in a way.
So less about individual justice, more about protecting the democratic system itself.
Yes, and that fits the general Athenian approach. Unlike Sparta, which relied heavily on coercion and fear, Athens preferred, at least in theory, to encourage good behavior through persuasion and exhortation.
But they still had laws for dealing with bad behavior within the citizen body, right? What about things like assault or serious misconduct?
Oh, definitely. And a key legal concept here was hubris.
We usually translate that as arrogance or excessive pride.
Yes, but in Athenian law, hubris had a much sharper, more specific legal meaning. It wasn't just about attitude.
What did it cover legally?
The term was specifically used for severe violations against a free person's physical integrity and honor. It mainly covered two things: serious physical assault against free citizens and acts related to sexual violence, sexual aggression, or violations of sexual honor.
Why link physical assault and sexual violence under hubris?
Because both were seen as fundamentally attacking the victim status. Their time, their standing as a free and respected member of the community. Committing hubris was seen as an attempt to degrade the victim, almost to treat them like a slave. It was an assault on the social and political order itself.
And we see these legal mechanisms playing out in real political battles, like the famous spat between Demosthenes and Aeschines.
Oh, that's a perfect example. A classic Athenian political dogfight fought through the courts. Demosthenes accused Aeschines of taking bribes from Philip of Macedon and lying about peace terms.
High-stakes political accusations.
Absolutely. But what's legally interesting is Demosthenes' counterargument about procedure. He didn't just deny the charges, he attacked how Aeschines brought the case.
What was wrong with the procedure, according to Demosthenes?
Demosthenes argued that if Aeschines genuinely believed he, Demosthenes, had made illegal proposals years earlier regarding the peace, Aeschines should have used a specific legal tool called the graphi paranomen.
The graphi paranomen. What was that?
It was a formal indictment against illegal proposals. Basically, a way to challenge a law or decree before or just after it passed, arguing it violated existing laws. It was the established, proper channel for policing political decisions legally.
And Aeschines didn't use it.
No, he waited years and then launched a more general personal attack in court. Demosthenes claimed this proved Aeschines wasn't interested in legal propriety, but was just driven by hostile rancor, insult, abuse, and defamation.
So even in bitter political fights, there were accepted rules of legal engagement.
Yes, the democracy insisted on using its specific legal tools. It aimed for a structured process, even when dealing with fierce political opposition.
Okay, let's pivot now. We're moving west across the Mediterranean from Athens to Rome. If Athens was experimenting with democratic controls, Rome seems much more focused on structure, codification, permanence.
That's a really key difference. The Roman legal mindset is anchored in the written law. Our sources stress that Roman law fundamentally starts with a code, the 12 Tables, way back in the 5th century BC.
So unlike maybe English common law, which theoretically grows out of custom.
Exactly. Rome starts with this foundational written text. It gives their whole legal system a different character focused on definition, rules, written authority.
And this emphasis on written public law leads to a really crucial principle, especially for managing a city and its resources.
Yes, the principle that private agreements cannot override public law. Equis publicum.
What does that mean in practice?
It means that no matter what deal you strike with your neighbor, no matter how formal your private contract is, You can't agree to do something that violates the state's established laws for the public good.
So I can't agree with my neighbor to, say, illegally tap into a public aqueduct crossing our land, even if we both want to.
Precisely. Or ignore building regulations or block a public right-of-way. The state's interest, the aequius publicum, always takes precedence over private arrangements. This is absolutely fundamental for regulating infrastructure, urban planning, shared resources, everything a complex state needs to manage.
It provides that bedrock of state authority.
It does. However, when we turn to Roman criminal law, this idea of a single universal code gets complicated. Very complicated. Because Roman justice was fundamentally unequal.
Unequal in what way?
It developed what the sources call a double scale of penalties. For the very same crime, the punishment you faced depended entirely on your social status.
Right. This is the divide between the honestiores and the humiliores. Tell us about that.
The honestiores, literally, the more honorable ones were the upper crust. Senators, equestrians, military veterans, Crucian town councilors, decurions, and anyone above them. This group received systematically lighter punishments.
And the humiliores.
That was basically everyone else, the lower people.
Okay.
And it didn't necessarily depend on wealth, but on recognized social standing. If you were humilior, you faced much harsher penalties for the same act.
So give us an example. What kind of difference are we talking about?
Well, for certain types of theft, assault, or public order offenses, an honestier might face a fine, confiscation of property, maybe temporary exile. But a humilior committing the same act could face torture, hard labor in the mines, crucifixion, or other forms of execution.
That's a staggering difference. And the sources say Emperor Hadrian had already formally exempted the honestiores from the death penalty for many crimes.
Yes, that exemption was largely in place. It shows how formalized this legal inequality became.
What's really striking is that there wasn't even a precise, exhaustive legal definition of who belonged in which group.
Exactly. It shows how deeply embedded this was. There wasn't a law saying, if you own X amount of land, you are honestier. It was based on recognized status, office held, birth, veteran status, things generally known within the community and acknowledged by the legal system without needing a specific checklist. Social reality shaped legal reality.
Okay, shifting back to the city itself, managing the physical space, the cura urbis, the care of the city, that fell to specific magistrates, right?
Yeah.
The aediles.
Yes. The aediles were crucial for the day-to-day running of Rome. Their job covered everything from overseeing markets and temples to maintaining roads and public order. They had real enforcement powers.
Like what? What could they actually do if, say, someone wasn't maintaining their part of the street?
They had the power to impose fines directly, but they could also take direct action. For example, if a property owner neglected the paving of the street in front of their house, a classic public nuisance, the aedile could fine them.
Okay.
Or they could hire someone else to do the paving work and then legally compel the negligent owner to pay the contractor's bill. They could seize property to cover the costs. They were the frontline regulators ensuring the city didn't fall apart.
So they handled the physical upkeep. What about policing public money, the treasury?
That was primarily the role of the quaestor. But the quaestorship came with this really interesting extra layer of responsibility, rooted deeply in Roman tradition, the mos maiorum. The quaestor wasn't just the guardian of the public funds, the custos of the aerarium. They were also considered the personal guardian, the custos of the consul or praetor they served under.
A personal guardian. What did that mean?
Roman custom, the mos maiorum, dictated that the relationship between a quaestor and his superior magistrate should be treated as incredibly close, almost like family. The sources say it was considered liberorum necessitudini proximum, closest to the bond between a father and son.
Wow. So not just a professional relationship, but a deeply personal moral bond.
Exactly. It was a sacred trust, and this had major legal and political implications.
How so?
Well, imagine a quaestor later bringing charges against or testifying against the very consul or praetor he had served, the man he was essentially sworn to protect.
That would be seen as a massive betrayal.
Worse than betrayal. Our sources describe such an act as a selis, a heinous crime, an act of impiety against the gods, and a portentum, a monstrous, unnatural omen. It shows the incredible weight placed on this relationship, likely as a way to ensure loyalty and integrity at the highest levels of financial administration and provincial governance. It was an internal check based on honor and custom.
We can't really talk about the functioning of these ancient cities, Rome especially, without confronting the sheer scale of the enslaved population that underpinned everything.
No, it's absolutely central. The labor force was immense. By the mid-1st century BC, estimates suggest there were over 1 million agricultural slaves just in Italy. That's not even counting urban slaves, domestic slaves, those working in mines or workshops.
1 million people legally classified as property just in Italian agriculture.
It's a staggering number, and this massive scale, this reliance on forced labor, naturally created enormous tension and required constant, often brutal control.
And we see the evidence of that tension in the major slave revolts.
Absolutely. The dates are infamous. 135 BC, 104 BC, and of course Spartacus starting in 73 BC. These weren't small riots. There were huge uprisings involving tens of thousands of rebel slaves. The sheer scale of these rebellions tells you something about the conditions and the level of coercion needed to maintain the system.
Yet even within this system where people are legally property, there were still philosophical discussions happening about liberty and human nature.
Yes, but those discussions often operated on a level detached from the legal reality. The sources point out that Greek and Roman ideas of liberty were often quite limited, woefully under-theorized in a way. Liberty was mostly defined simply as not being a slave.
Just the opposite of slavery.
Exactly. It remained parasitic upon the binarism of slave and free. There wasn't a deep, widespread philosophical challenge from within the political mainstream questioning the fundamental legitimacy of owning another human being.
But were there any thinkers who pushed back, even subtly?
Well, you have figures like the philosopher Philo. He couldn't change the legal status, obviously, but he introduced an interesting distinction. He argued that while slaves might rank lower in fortune, meaning their external circumstances, their legal status, they could still claim the same nature as their masters.
Same essential human nature, despite different legal standing.
Right. It's a subtle argument, but it implies a shared humanity. Philo used it to argue against the excessive cruelty of masters, suggesting that, in essence, the enslaved person deserved a degree of humane consideration because their fundamental nature was no different. It was a moral argument, not a legal one.
Now let's look back at Athens for a moment. Even in the democracy, which valued persuasion for its citizens, the legal treatment of slaves was starkly different, especially for serious crimes like murder.
Absolutely. The contrast is incredibly sharp. If a free Athenian citizen committed willful murder, the penalty was death. However, they usually had the option of going into exile before the final verdict, saving their life but losing their home and citizenship.
They had an out of sorts. What about an enslaved person?
No such option. Plato's laws, which likely reflect some contemporary practices or ideals, prescribe a very specific, gruesome, and ritualistic punishment for a slave guilty of willful murder.
What did it involve?
It was a two-stage process designed for maximum public degradation. First, the public executioner had to take the convicted slave to a location where the tomb of the murdered person was visible. There, the slave was to be whipped severely.
Whipped in front of the victim's tomb.
Yes. The number of lashes was even specified by the prosecutor in the trial. Only after this ritual scourging, if the slave was still alive, would the executioner finally kill them.
What was the point of that horrible ritual at the tomb?
It was pure status reinforcement. It wasn't just punishment. It was a public spectacle underlining the absolute difference between slave and free. The slave's body was violated and degraded in sight of the free citizen's resting place, powerfully demonstrating the perceived gravity of a slave taking a free life. It served a brutal social policing function.
Grim. But the sources also add a small note of caution about everyday punishment in Athens.
Yes, there's a suggestion, a tentative one, that for more routine, day-to-day discipline by masters, Athenian practices might have had a peculiar character. Perhaps, some argue, not reaching the same levels of calculated, cold-blooded cruelty found in large-scale plantation systems known from other periods and places.
Like the Roman latifundia or later examples.
Possibly, but it's important not to romanticize it. It was still systematic ownership and punishment of human beings. And the legal penalties for major crimes, as we've seen, were incredibly harsh and clearly demarcated by status.
Okay, for our final section, let's look at the legal plumbing that makes complex city life possible. The laws governing agreements, trade, obligations. Contract law, basically. How did Rome develop the idea of a binding promise, separate from just handing something over?
This is a really fundamental step in legal thinking. In early Rome, the act of physically conveying property and the act of creating a debt or obligation were often blurred together under one concept, nexum.
So giving you something might automatically mean you owe me something back, all in one legal action.
Roughly, yes. The physical transfer, nexum, often implied or created the obligation simultaneously. It became so intertwined that as Roman law became more sophisticated, they actually had to invent a new specific term, mancipium or mancipatio, just to signify the formal public act of transferring ownership itself.
Ah, so they needed a way to say, this is just the transfer of the thing, not necessarily the creation of a debt.
Precisely. This deliberate separation of conveyance, changing who owns the thing, from contract, creating a binding future obligation, is what allows for more complex transactions. Think about mortgages, loans secured by property. You need that clear legal distinction.
Let's take a basic example, a simple loan. How did Roman law define lending, things like money or grain, things that get used up? This was the mutium, right?
Yes, mutium was the specific contract for a loan of consumable goods, money, wine, oil, grain, anything where you don't expect the exact same item back. The core legal principle was ex meo tuum. From being mine, it becomes yours.
So the borrower actually becomes the owner of the specific coins or the specific wine I lend them.
That's right, the ownership transfers. And because they now own it, their obligation isn't to return those identical items.
What is the obligation then?
The obligation is to restore other things of the same kind, quantity, and quality. So if I lend you 100 sesterces, you owe me back 100 sesterces, but not the exact same physical coins. If I lend you a measure of wheat, you owe me back the same measure of equivalent quality wheat.
That makes sense for consumables. How did that differ from lending something you do expect back, like a tool?
That was a different contract, called comodatum, a loan for use. There, the borrower does not become the owner, and they are obligated to return the exact same item they borrowed in good condition, accounting for normal wear and tear. Two distinct legal frameworks for different kinds of lending.
Very clear. Now, what about agreements involving services or advice? The Romans had rules for the mandate or commission. When did giving someone instructions or advice become legally binding?
This gets into agency and responsibility. A true, legally enforceable contract of mandate was formed only if the commission, the task you were asked to do, was given either in the interest of the person giving the instruction, the mandator, or in the interest of some third party.
Okay, so if I ask you to manage my farm while I'm away, that's a mandate in my interest.
Correct. Or if I ask you to deliver a message to someone else, that's arguably in the third party's interest. Or maybe mine. Both could form a binding mandate.
But what if the advice or instruction is purely for the benefit of the person receiving it? Like if I just tell you, hey, you should invest your spare cash.
The sources call that a superfluous mandate. If the advice or commission is solely for the recipient's own benefit, you should put that money you've got sitting idle out at interest. It creates no legal obligation on the advisor.
Meaning,
if you follow my advice, invest your money, and then lose it all because the borrower defaults, you can't sue me under the law of mandate, actio endati.
why not? It was my suggestion.
Because, as the Romans reasoned, any action taken purely for your own benefit should ultimately be based on your own judgment. The law drew a line between friendly advice and a formal agency relationship where one person acts legally on behalf of another. It stopped the courts being clogged with claims over bad investment tips.
A practical distinction. Finally, Roman law wasn't always completely rigid.
Yeah.
There was this concept that allowed for flexibility, right? The bona fide judicia.
Yes, the good faith judgments. This was incredibly important. While some legal actions were stricti aurius, strictly by the letter of the law, where the judge had very little room to move, many core commercial contracts were different.
Like buying and selling.
Exactly. Sale, emptio vindicio, partnership, societas, hire locatio conductio, these were classed as bona fide judicia.
And what did that classification mean for the judge hearing the case?
It gave the judge significant discretion. They were empowered, even obligated, to consider what was fair and reasonable between the parties in good faith, ex bona fide.
So not just the literal words of the contract.
Not just the words. Crucially, the judge could take into account defenses, counterclaims, or circumstances that the defendant might not have even formally raised in their initial legal plea if good faith required it. It allowed the law to adapt to the complexities and unstated assumptions of real-world business dealings, providing a vital element of fairness and equity. #outro.
Well, this has been quite the journey through the legal alleyways of Athens and Rome. It's clear these ancient cities weren't just built with stone and mortar, but also with intricate, sometimes quite surprising legal codes.
Absolutely. We've seen these layers of control, haven't we? From Athens trying to manage political ambition through things like ostracism, or even deliberately choosing average honesty over exceptional ability with the lot system for archons.
Right, and then shifting to Rome, with that stark legal divide based purely on status, the honestiores getting one form of justice, the humiliores a much harsher one. It really hits home how different their conception of equality before the law was.
And underlying it all, those detailed rules about everyday life and commerce. The aediles making sure streets were paved, the quaestor bound by an almost familial loyalty, the careful distinctions in contract law separating ownership from obligation.
Yeah, whether it's a general losing command after just one day in Athens, or a Roman slave facing that horrifying ritual punishment, or just the definition of the simple loan. These legal channels, often invisible to us now, really dictated the flow of power, money, and life itself.
And you know, what really stands out, particularly with Rome, is this fascinating tension. They build the system on the bedrock of a written code, the 12 tables, the symbol of permanence.
Right, the foundation.
But almost immediately, they realize that rigid code isn't enough to handle the messy reality of a growing, complex, status-obsessed society. So they develop this parallel track, the Praetor's Edict, the Aedilius Honorarium, which is much more flexible, based on equity and the Praetor's discretion.
So the formal law and this more adaptable judge-made law operating side by side.
Exactly. And it leaves you with a really interesting question, I think. When your official written laws can't keep up with social change or seem unjust in certain situations, how much of your actual lived justice system ends up relying not on the law books, but on the discretion, the personal judgment of powerful officials like the praetor? Where does the real power to define justice lie?
That's a great point to ponder. A really rich, deep dive into the legal architecture of the ancient world. Thank you so much for guiding us through these sources.
My pleasure. It's always fascinating to see how these foundational systems were put together.